Thank you. I hope you all will be patient while I set up my regalia here. Thank you all for coming out this evening. Without further ado, let me get right into this. Decades after the Civil War ended, Catherine Stone, whom you see on the screen, published her memoirs of what she called the gay, busy life that she and her wealthy slave-owning family had led on their 1,200-acre plantation in pre-war Louisiana. For members of her family, she recalled, these are her words, there was always something going on. Formal dining, spend the days, evening parties, riding frolics, fox hunts, and to assist with these and other diversions, Catherine added, her family had, again her words, quite a corps of servants to keep us well waited on, since naturally no one expected to wait on himself. Each of Catherine Stone's younger brothers also, again her words, owned a little darky in the quarters who would eventually become his body servant. And to generate the wealth that sustained the Stone family's life of, again her words, luxurious ease, some 150 enslaved human beings toiled in the plantation's cotton and cane fields, 6 days a week after week, month after month, year after year. The Civil War's outbreak in April of 1861 signaled the beginning of the end of the Stone family's accustomed wealth and comfort. As Catherine was soon confiding to her diary, the fighting between North and South infected slaves with the hope of radical change in their condition. They were therefore, she said, becoming lazy and disobedient, and they were giving a lot of trouble. Her words again, generally. And one evening, as Catherine and her relatives sat on the veranda of their plantation home, someone whom she described as a runaway Negro darted past them. And Catherine's brothers leapt to the pursuit, but the desperate fugitive made good his escape. And the Stones and their neighbors began to worry that they were, in her words, living on a landmine. Seeking some refuge from these anxieties, Catherine turned, she said, to the fictional works of a then popular 19th century Southern author, Edgar Allan Poe. But with her nerves already frayed, she decided that she was going to avoid his most fearsome pieces, as she puts it. And perhaps, we don't know, but perhaps she chose The Fall of the House of Usher. Well, it's not a particularly grisly story. It's not filled, as are some of the Poe stories, with grim supernatural horrors, which might have made this short story seem a relatively safe distraction from the unsettling events around her. As that story begins, you may recall, Poe's narrator is paying a visit to a friend, a man named Roderick Usher, who is the heir of an old, wealthy, and venerable family, and he's the current master of its imposing Usher mansion. And at first glance, this mansion's massive evidence, says the narrator, gave little token of instability. But its seeming solidity, he goes on to say, concealed a barely perceptible fissure that ran down through it from its roof to its foundation. Poe's narrator, after spending some time chatting with Usher, suddenly hears the mansion's hidden structural fault begin to announce itself. First in a muted tremor, then in a powerful shudder, and then a mounting roar. And finally, as the narrator watches in shock and horror, the mansion's walls begin to tremble. Its barely discernible fissure gapes way open. The walls tumble. The august mansion collapses, burying its owner in the rubble. And the waters of the lake that surround the mansion then close, Poe says, sullenly and silently over the fragments of the House of Usher. Catherine Stone chose this book to relieve her of her anxieties. One imagines that it wound up offering her relatively little comfort. Because, in fact, she too, after all, resided in an imposing and outwardly sturdy structure, the House of Dixie, the slavery-based society of the American South. And hers, too, was already beginning to display the deep fissures that ran through it. And as the Civil War continued, those fissures were going to widen until the whole structure eventually collapsed. Some of the fissures that ran through the House of Dixie and that the Civil War greatly widened divided white Southerners from one another. The pro-Confederate war effort, for example, eroded white unity in the South by demanding too much of it. It demanded too much of some slave owners, especially those in the hills and the mountains, where resentment grew that the ever heavier burdens of fighting this war to preserve slavery were failing to accomplish their goal, and meanwhile were falling disproportionately on those with less of a stake in that war. But the war effort also proved too demanding in the eyes of many members of the Southern elite, who proved to be too concerned with safeguarding their individual wealth and privileges to cooperate fully with the Confederate government struggling to protect the interests of slave owners as a whole. And those are aspects of the book that I'm discussing with you today. But this evening, I'd like to talk to you about the most important fissure that ran through the House of Dixie, slavery, and the three ways that slavery figured in the origin and the progress of the Civil War. First of all, as the war's central cause. Secondly, as a crucial source of military power deployed during that war. And third, slavery's erosion during the war and its destruction, both of those things as an eventual Union goal, the destruction of slavery as an eventual conscious, deliberate Union goal. So let's start with cause. As you may know, in a recent national survey, half of all those people, half of all those Americans who were polled denied that slavery was the main cause of the U.S. Civil War. And that view is apparently gaining ground, not losing ground, because among younger people polled, those below 30 years of age, fully 3 out of 5 denied slavery's centrality to the war's origin. But in 1860 and 61, leaders of both the Union and the Confederacy knew and said that slavery and the escalating national dispute over slavery's future was precisely what was leading most of the Southern states to break from and break up the United States, thereby initiating the costliest war in the country's history. Abraham Lincoln noted in his first inaugural address that, quote, "One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended, and this is the only substantial dispute. Period." Close quote. The President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis, reminded his Congress in 1861, these are his words, "The labor of African slaves was and is indispensable to our prosperity, so that with interests of such overwhelming magnitude imperiled by the election to the presidency of an anti-slavery man like Abraham Lincoln," he meant, The people of the southern states, he said, were driven to the adoption of some course of action to avert the